Afternoon, everyone. It's Thriving Matters Studio and a little bit of Coldplay to start us off this afternoon. I'm surrounded by three very handsome gents, all from the Catholic Schools Office, Armidale Diocese, and they're going to tell us all about why they went on such a big road trip after our first lot of lockdown for our education system in New South Wales. So how are you all? So in the top right-hand corner, I have Mr. Rod Whelen. So how are you, Rod?
Good, thanks, Karen. Hello.
You're well? You're on the green screen. So everyone, this is Rod on the green screen. Now, just directly below him is Jason Hanrahan, and I'm just trying to just turn this off. How are you, Jason?
Good, thank you.
There we go. I've managed it. And Justin, with the beautiful headphones on, you've got your Bose on, I imagine, there, Justin. You're all very welcome. So I'm excited this afternoon. I have a little bit of a different background. I'm actually away from home, so you get another room. So the wonders of technology during our pandemic have been enablers for us, even though there are always some little hiccups. So listeners, thank you for joining in again today. Thriving Matters Studio is all about education matters, and we're looking at what it is that we can learn from what we're doing to actually make a better future for the learning of our students. So we're going to talk all things road trip today. So Jason, help us understand what you three handsome gents do at the Catholic Schools Office up in Armidale. Let us know what your job is.
Thanks, Kerry. We're called school performance leaders. So our role, I guess it's a different or a variation of the schools consultant role. Our role is to connect with schools, support schools on their improvement journeys. And so there's a whole lot of different things that we do associated with that, trying to help build the school teams to improve the learning and teaching in our schools.
That would be really a very interesting job. The role you play would get you to meet so many amazing people. The connections are really what you're on about. Your role talks about connections between individuals in your schools, your leaders, your teachers, your staff, your students, your parent community. So it's very holistic, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a really interesting and rewarding role. It's been wonderful so far.
Now, we're talking about a system of schools in the northwest of New South Wales, absolutely stunning country, but give us an idea of the size of your schools, the number of them. Because I imagine they're quite remote, and then some very large regional areas.
Yeah, so the diocese goes from all the way up to Mungandai, which is on the Queensland-New South Wales border in the northwest. Go across to east to Tenterfield, down towards Armidale, Narrabri. What's the most south there, boys?
Corindai.
Corindai is one of the most south. Big centres like Tamworth. So big centres with schools of 850 students, big primary schools of 550, 600 students, all the way to smaller schools of 25 to 40 students as well. So a big range, three secondary schools, 2 K-10 schools, and the rest are primary schools.
That's really quite diverse, isn't it? Yeah. How many Ks do you do? I mean, I think you'd be clocking them up when you're out on the road. There'd be a few there.
Yeah, probably more than some of us wanted, more than we need to sometimes. But lots of Ks. Like it's about 370 Ks to Mungandai from Armidale.
Yeah.
So lots of Ks.
All right. All right. Now we're looking at in our previous episodes on Thriving Matters Studio, we've been looking at leadership, wellbeing, what it is about our communities and how their learning communities are working together. And of course, we've been locked down. And we can call it lots of different things, but we can call it remote learning, we could call it virtual learning, we could call it blended, we could call it homeschooling. So, Rod, would you give us an idea of what was the impetus for the trip around the diocese and just help us get the picture of why you did what you did. And then, all of you can just join in and help us with understanding how it all went.
Thanks, Carrie. When this started, there was a really clear message from system leadership to principals and schools that we trust you in your work. So rather than giving directives about what it would look like in the diocese, particularly because of the diversity of communities and size of schools and even resourcing of schools, there was a really clear message from Director Chris Smythe and all others in the system: we trust you. So that was relayed from principals and leadership teams to staff. And we picked up really quickly that some of the anxieties that people reported on working in other systems was the highly directive nature of the whole thing. And we had decided early on that wasn't going to be the case here. We knew that these highly capable teams would do whatever was required in the next best step in supporting learning and wellbeing for our children and young people. And we were really quite interested in seeing how that unfolded. As soon as you say you'll do it like this, you take away an opportunity for some inquiry cycle thinking, some action research looking. We went out to see how this situation had accelerated our thinking prior to it, or to see what it would do to help us discern what our next best steps were for the system were. We didn't go out thinking, okay, what we see now is going to be here forever. We were more interested in going to see how a team of highly skilled, helpful adults would adapt to this, and in the context where we trusted them to do what was best for their community, we were more interested in going out to see what they come up with.
You really piqued your curiosity cycle, didn't you, by having that attitude, looking at it through that great lens that you had. So
it also then it's much easier to say, look, we're coming to visit, but all we're doing is to see what great work you've done.
And I imagine you've got some fabulous examples. So we'll get to that. Justin, what about how you were received? Usually country towns give you a bit of a hurrah. When you come in with, did they sort of say, look, who's coming to town, welcome you? It may have been a little bit different to that, but how did you find going around? What was it like for you?
Yeah, I think it's just really special in terms of that drive out, especially between Narrabri and Walgett. It's about 200 kilometres of really flat ground. And last year, with the bush suffering through immense drought, seeing the rain and the crops in the ground, it was a sort of a really surreal experience in many ways in the backdrop of a pandemic. And I remember sort of going in and into one school in particular, and just shaking hands with a bloke I hadn't seen in a while. Just a really sort of like a hardworking person, and just to be welcomed into that community. It just felt like a tremendous privilege and a real example of that bush hospitality on show.
Well, it's I'm a Cooma girl. I grew up in the country as well, and so you have some amazing memories of how people rally, that connectedness, how you rally for lots of different causes to help, to assist when disasters strike, when there's massive change afoot. So I'm not surprised, and I'm so pleased that you got to experience some hometown hospitality. Tell me about what you saw, what you observed, because we've got two of these, and they're very, very useful if we tune them up. Tell me what you saw and observed around leadership, around wellbeing, around student voice, So I'm going to let you just go with it. So jump in there and to tell us what you saw, what you heard, what you observed.
One of the greatest things, Carrie, I think Rod might have mentioned this before, was the one thing that struck me when we went round, and the three of us as we went round, was the deep connection that kids, teachers and families have with their school community, and the deep connection the school community has with the local community, and the importance of the role of the school in that local community as well. And I think what we mentioned about trusting the schools to make the right choice or the right next step based upon their own context, and the trust we had in them, or the trust that was placed in them, was really rewarded. And what we get from the message we got, particularly, and our students were a great example. Everywhere we went when we spoke to students was that deep connection they had with their school, the sense of gratitude those kids had for the work that the teachers did and the work that the school did to try and keep them learning. And that was particularly evident in our secondary school spaces. I think that was one of the most rewarding things and heartwarming things to learn as we went around, and the deep connect, the fact that connection and participation allowed the kids to continue learning at a high level.
Yeah, you're right there, Jason. Like, in terms of that deep connection that schools are sort of fostering, like, it builds up trust. And I'm not quite sure what the experiences were like in the sort of the metropolitan areas, but what I felt was the social contract in those towns were really strong. And I remember having this conversation with one teacher, and this one teacher, they weren't scared, like so much scared as the virus, but they were scared about bringing it back into the town, and that was a sort of a real fear. But in terms of the sort of like students' connections to the school are really important, but also sort of the teachers and the school leaders' connection to the school was important.
And I think I was struck before we started our tour, right at the start of the year, we'd been talking about the need to do fewer things in schools to make sure that students and staff are engaged in meaningful, worthwhile work. And we arrived there and saw this happening. We're trying to say that there's not a lot of ideas in schools. We've got a collective responsibility to improve conditions of leadership, teaching, learning, wellbeing, and it's all the same work. And we want to reduce it to a few most important things and strip away the unnecessary. And what this pandemic did is hurried us along a little bit with stripping away the unnecessary. And we ask those questions. We want to reduce teacher non-classroom work. We want to make the classroom the main place of learning and of assessment. That's all thrown in the air in a pandemic, but the way the teachers continued to ensure that students had meaningful, worthwhile work, and the way that they stripped away the unnecessary was really helpful in us saying, okay, that was the right idea. We've got to do more of that. And schools return to whatever a future normal looks like.
You know, one of the great things about sort of listening to Rod is his deep reflection, and it sort of reminds me of a white paper that Microsoft produced during the pandemic around remote learning. And in that, Microsoft were talking about that we believe that the sudden shift to remote learning, while tremendously difficult, has propelled school system leaders and educators to reflect deeply on what works best for students and what innovation should be taken up. And, you know, like, just in hearing that, like, it's the sort of the reflection that's able to drive those next steps, which is the important thing.
Well, student voice is critical in your reflections on this and the questions that you ask. So I have had some students on the show on a previous episode, and they were fantastic. They were very frank up front and sent with great suggestions. It wasn't antagonistic, but it was really future focused in a way. So I'd be interested in some of the student voice that you heard, Rod.
One of the, we can name towns, we won't name school, but we went to a school in Gunnedah and spoke to an extraordinary group of young people. And we don't go in and say, okay, tell us about learning, tell us what's working, what's not. No, we say, how's this been for you?
Yeah.
How's it felt to be part of this school community? And the convictions and the great appreciation those students had for one another, for their teachers, for their families, and the empathy they had for other students who were doing it tougher than them. You know, we know that children and young people are extraordinary, but it's just great when you're there to hear it. And it was so affirming, and without giving away too many details, the stories that representative group of students told us about student colleagues who they knew were doing it tough and what they'd done to help them to connect was quite inspiring. But the best thing, of course, is that you're hearing the same sentiments from students and from teachers. And one of the things that we are getting more clearly focused on is, you know, a starting point for a skilled team of helpful adults in a system. You've got to raise the bar fairly high. And we would say we want all our adults to have an unconditional, high positive regard for children and young people. Or if you don't, you're in the wrong game, you know?
Yeah.
To hear our teachers give clear indication of that high regard and to hear that echoed back from our students made us really clear that our first work is a relational one, and it's to build connection to the school. It's helped us shape our annual improvement planning for next year. The last thing we would do would be to say, here's all our headings, what are you going to do under each of those headings?
Yeah.
We would now be saying, what's been your area of greatest positive influence? How can you amplify that influence? And by the way, thanks for it. It leads to great outcomes for young people in our schools. What are some challenges? And what's the next best step forward for your school community? And that's really different from saying, okay, show us evidence of improvement in this area, and this area. It's also helped us to say, get your leadership team right first, get your middle leaders right, and the vast majority are. But the notion that ineffective teams get straight to work, spend some time talking about that collaborative professionalism that we need for high-functioning teams.
Yeah.
Let's focus on supporting you to get that right before we start to say, what are we going to do? And when we decide what we're going to do, let's make sure that it involves worthwhile, meaningful learning for our students.
Can I pick up there on something Rod said, Carrie, a couple of things. The notion of that high-functioning team was really important during that period. And we found that those schools that identified themselves as having high-functioning teams were actually better placed to respond more quickly and more effectively to the challenge at the time. But what it also did, one of our learnings was that actually some of the teams that were not as high-performing prior to were forced into that collaborative professionalism. They were forced into, instead of having planned collaboration time, having to collaborate all the time. And that's something that's been taken from that. And as Rod mentioned, we need to be working on getting the team right first. Another thing sorry, Justin, you go.
No, you're right, Jason.
I was just saying another thing that was great about when we talk about student voice. The students talked a lot about having greater autonomy during that time and choosing what they learnt and learning at their own pace. And what they were able to do, schools were able to do, without us actually listening to that voice really clearly, make adjustments on the run to the way they taught. Even, for example, one of the kids, or a number of schools, the kids would say to us, particularly early on, the instruction that the teachers gave them via the Loom videos or the clips went for too long. And they were really clear. Kids could give us, in primary school, could give us exactly how much time they thought they needed to go for, between 5 and 10 minutes, no longer. And so based on that feedback, teachers were able to adjust what they did in terms of the learning they were providing for the students, which made it much more meaningful for the kids. Schools, and there's a number of schools that were able to make adjustments to the way when the kids returned, to listen to that voice. So students, for example, wanting more autonomy, wanting to be able to learn at their own pace, some schools were able to make adjustments and give students in senior years or year 12 a day per week where they could learn from home, or come into school, depending on what suited them best. So there's some really great things that have come out of it that fit around that student choice and voice, and being able to work in teams.
I think one of the things I've heard in nearly every episode that we've done since pandemic started is this realisation that autonomy, to be able to make decisions for your context, is one of the most empowering things for our leadership teams. And part of your role will be to look at the needs of your leadership teams in how they look at student learning and wellbeing, because wellbeing has just really escalated. It's really amplified its importance, because in all the stories that you heard, the difficulties that some families and some individuals were facing were fairly managed. Families without income, families with who didn't have the opportunity of getting to services that they needed. A whole lot of different things would be impacting on their wellbeing as well. So one of the beautiful things is that the autonomy seems to be up there nearly in every system. I've talked to Victorian teachers, Queensland, everywhere around the state, Adelaide, South Australia, New Zealand. Autonomy is a big thing for leadership within school teams, and lessening of the imposed directions. So thank you for that.
And there's that, we're well aware of that sometimes battle between coherence and autonomy. Mm-hmm. So Armidale Diocese is several years into some fairly directed areas, particularly around use of data to inform next steps in learning. There's been collaboration time built into the timetable. So professional learning teams that make, we know the next step is to give autonomy, greater autonomy now for schools to be part of the system agenda, but also to set their own agenda. And we're ready to step past that notion of we all do this at the same time together. That was necessary, but time for next step. Again, very similar to what we want for our students, we want for our staff, the ability to have some voice in what next best steps are.
Yeah, and voice is just as critical for your staff and your teachers as your students, and also your parents. So if we talk stakeholders, the voice is there, and coming together is what you're being able to share with us.
Yeah, and really to build on that, Carrie, like what we're trying to do at the moment in our annual improvement process is we're thinking about the system and thinking about the best way to co-design the system so that we can unlock the voice of the stakeholders and as many stakeholders as possible. So making sure that we sort of, like the organisation means something for our students, our people, our parents, our rural communities, and our church as well, being a Catholic system.
Yes. I'm going to ask you now if the good Aussie spirit had come through in some of your collaborations that you had in the various school communities, and I look at wellbeing as a way that we are able to self-manage ourselves, our emotional aspects, the way that we think, the way that we make decisions, the way we process different things that happen to us. And the pandemic was and is still causing some massive shifts in the way we are living, the way we're learning, and how we are managing that. So the cheeky girl in me says, have you got some funny stories, which are not disrespectful but are highlighting this notion of country connectedness, of regional and community being together and pitching in together. So I was just wondering if you had a couple of interesting stories that you might share with us around what it was you saw on your road trip. Because really what you've been doing is an action research study, and it's a privilege to be able to do it in face-to-face in times. And now we're, because when I look at this, I think it's highly possible that these coronaviruses or particular viruses will not be eradicated. They will continue to grow and appear in different ways. And so this might not be the only time that this has happened to us. Our Victorian colleagues have had a double lockdown. So it's highly possible that we are going to be looking at a blended way of educating, on face-to-face, on-site, as well as virtual. So you got any?
Oh, I don't know if it's funny, but we heard stories of kids that because they live out on properties, as they're trying to connect to the online mode of learning, they're set up a little classroom in a horse trailer on the top of a hill, way away from the house, so they could get some mobile service to be able to do the work. That's commitment to me. Those sorts of stories.
That's innovation, though, don't you think? That's here. I've got a problem. How am I going to solve it? That's action research in the paddock, in the top paddock. Yeah, getting the that's the way we all do, and it's experiential learning. And our kids, I think, we often underestimate their creativeness, their imagination, and the way they can think through their projects and their experiments. Yeah.
Very cool.
What else have we heard about? Particularly, I'm interested in thriving and wellbeing. So, was there a couple of things that you've actually been on your mind around a way forward for wellbeing?
Yeah, one of the things that we used during the time was, so we started to think about the data that we needed, and not just like to unpack that. It's more around evidence of impact. So the stuff that we're looking at, like in terms of wellbeing, is that we had a principal equity survey that we shared with the principals, and then we were able to sort of like highlight the pressure points in schools and what we needed to do for certain sections in our community, in particular like our students with disabilities. Also, another really strong community in Armidale is our ATSI community, our Aboriginal community. And so then we were able to design those sort of next steps with those things in mind. An interesting point was around, we also conducted a principal wellbeing survey when everything was being thrown up in the air. We didn't quite know like what those next steps were, and identifying for us where those pressure points lay was really important. And just going back over my notes, like getting the home learning right was really important for school leadership teams. Workforce protection being equally important, getting the communication channels right, and then also the big focus on wellbeing. Like Rod obviously knows well, is shaped more about wellbeing. If you want to continue, Rod.
So the big thing for us in our schools is our students knowing that they're valued, cared for, and respected, and the notion that becomes before all else. and really it comes before else. We would insist that we aren't just saying that. So, when we walk around into our primary schools are quite consistent. You walk into them, most of the schools have open spaces. They are calm. You can tell that the students feel cared for, valued and respected. And it's a real privilege to walk into those places. We've got 2 central schools that go K to 10, and we've got 3 7 to 12 high schools. So we've got the full variety. And we walk into the secondary schools and we see the same thing, though in different settings, obviously, because you're changing teachers 5 times a day. There's a bigger population on the ground. But despite those different contexts, if the first work is to ensure that our kids feel valued and respected, and to reflect on what that means in terms of the language we use, the coaching voice we use in a class rather than the teaching voice, hopefully the dismantling of a control, managed, discipline approach to behaviour, and really quite explicitly saying our schools are places that recognise children and young people are complex human beings deserving of our respect and admiration. Now, the notion of teamwork works at a leadership team. It's really important at middle leadership level, but it's most important at the classroom level when we consider the adults and the students they are working with to be a learning team. And one thing I'm sure Jason and Justin will agree really strongly, when you go around and talk to young people in our schools, particularly in the secondary schools, they often get a bad rap. We often get this disgraceful media projection that kids in our schools are out of control. Nothing could be further from the truth from the schools that we saw. Their concern for one another and their concern for their teacher colleagues, and I use that word really deliberately. At its best, they do work as colleagues. Absolute privilege to be associated with. But it puts our focus again onto what does the most important place is classrooms. We say over and over here that students spend 15,000 hours, K to 12, a school. That is in itself a huge formative influence on the lives of those young people.
It is.
And you think about our collective responsibility to make sure that's a pretty good place for them. And to be part of a system where that's the thinking, pretty exciting. Our next push is a scaffold for describing behaviour, de-escalating behaviour, teaching of replacement behaviours, so that we get a consistent idea, particularly the incidence of students in the dais who may have social, emotional behaviour difficulties. And we're, like most systems in Australia, we're probably ashamed that 20 years ago, if there was a behaviour issue, you might have found yourself out on the street. If there was a learning issue, you might have been offered more support. So it's reinforced our belief that the constant question we have to be asking is, are we meeting the needs of this young person here?
Well, that's up front and centre, isn't it?
It's a big question.
And
for most of our kids, Carrie, wellbeing, if we teach them well, we're good quality student-centred teaching, we create that connection and participation with the school and with their class. We give them the opportunity to work as a team, as Rod said, in a classroom sense. For most of our kids, that will look after their well-being. They'll be happy, well-adjusted young people who just want to learn. And And then, like Rod said, we put steps in place for those that have other issues or have some difficulties because of various reasons.
Well, we look after our own, don't we? We look after everyone in the community, and that's my view of what a community is. We try and look after it, look after each other. You've given us a great example of what you've been able to see and hear and notice, and how it's going to affect the way you move forward. Because that would be every single education system in Australia, and I believe globally, would be looking at how do we even plan perhaps for continued viruses or continued situations where we haven't got access to face-to-face, that's 100% of the time. Really, schools took on a large proportion of a health response for the nation. Yeah, that's so, as well as our policing and our nursing areas, our health systems. So the three large employers of face-to-face people have been involved in our response to trying to provide the best education possible in a time of great change. Something that we've been, a lot of us have either felt quite okay with, or some of us have found very difficult, because we're social beings. And part of, you would have heard, I imagine, from your students and your teachers and your families, what it was like to feel quite isolated physically from each other. And how they were able to adjust the way that they were feeling about that. And I thank you for telling us a little bit about what happened on the road trip. Now, I'm not sure, did you all go together at the same time? How did you work it out?
Mostly. So there's, for most schools, the three of us were there, and for some of them, only two of us could be there at certain points. But we mostly went to all the schools together, which was great for us. We're only new in this job this year, so it was good for us to spend some more time together, and also good for us to. Well, we really hadn't got out to visit the schools before remote learning, so kicked off. So we were able to create those connections and develop those relationships ourselves on that road trip as well.
Well, it's quite easy to be in the office, so to speak, and send out the directives and believe that you know your communities because of what you believe from paperwork or from conversations, but something different to be out there with the communities in actually seeing exactly how things were playing out and listening. So I would, I'm wondering, you think you might do it again? Would it be a strategy that you would try again?
Yeah, we're next week, Carrie, we're going out again on the road. So co-designing our annual improvement plans with schools. Being a school performance leader in Armidale requires a lot of travel. You get used to listening to really good podcasts, playlists, and and just take in the beauty of the Australian bush. Hey.
It's actually quite beautiful, the metaphor of nature with leadership, nature with wellbeing, nature with connection. I really like a good metaphor, and I think we've experienced a lot of it this afternoon. So I would love to actually see the visuals, some of the visuals of what you see, the beautiful sunsets, and how did the sunset play out in Gunnedah? How did the call of the magpies, the early morning, happen at Mungandai? And you could relate that to leadership as well.
And the other big thing that's happened up here this year, I know when I came up here initially, maybe October last year, November last year, the area is in serious drought. And we've been lucky enough that most of the region has had really farm-saving rains. And the beautiful Liverpool Plains in all its glory this year, driving from Gunnedah to Corindai, is one of rural Australia's great sites. We saw lots. Some of those communities were at breaking point, and some of them still are, because the rain. It might mean that your crop is fine, but those who sold off stock, restocking is nearly impossible. Yeah. Lots of our families are in this beautiful setting where there's lots of feed and can't afford to restock. Luckily, lots of them have these superb crops that are the best in 7 years. One of the things we noted, particularly at the high schools, was the number of farming families we serve. And again, at one town, the number of kids who told us what they do to help mum and dad at home on the farm is a real eye-opener, and a couple of very touching stories about students so aware of the pressure that their parents have been under and strategies they use to help at home. And the number of older students who talked about how their work, apart from the farm work, was to help a younger brother or sister with their learning. It was extraordinary. And I'm not saying it's different there. I'm sure it happened all over the country, but yeah, it was good to hear.
Oh, we all know that our kids learn not just through books, reading, writing, whatever it is that they do, their subjects. They're learning from life, and I think that's, Rod, that's what you're adding to the conversation here, that the learning during this time, the contribution to your family, to the well-being of your family and your community is very strong, and it's a great teacher. And we probably don't give our kids as much credit, and I think that's what you were alluding to before. We need to actually acknowledge the value that they do place. I've got to thank you all this afternoon. I know that it's Tuesday afternoon. Everyone has different things to do, so I want you to go and do them. I want to thank you. Justin, thanks for all your contribution this afternoon.
Thank you, Carrie.
And I'm glad you didn't tell the story about the supermarket. And I'll let our listeners keep wondering about that. Thank you, Jason, for
Thanks, Carrie.
For that. And I know that you've got some colleagues around the state going, hi, how are you? Thank you, Rod, very much. Great to see you all again. Thank you for your contribution. I'd love to hear about the return visit, but I'd really like to see some of the visuals as well. Perhaps you should take this with you or the camera and put it together.
Will do.
See you. All right.
Thanks, Carrie.
Listeners, if you'd like to know a little bit more about Rod, Justin or Jason, Catholic Schools Office, Diocese of Armidale, you can find that address very easily online through social media as well. And I'd like to really thank them for adding to their afternoon here. And if you'd like to know more about what I do, you can find me on all socials, carriebenedette.com, and our Thriving Matters conversations, and also our Thriving Matters podcasts. So over to you. Please take care of your good selves. Your thriving matters, and our education matters more than ever. So let's all increase our awareness and enjoy what it is that we're learning, and create those circumstances where we can learn beyond our imagination. So over to bye, everybody. I'll see you next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.